Hey everybody, Stephen Bauman here, Hour of History podcast. This week, excellent conversation with Adam Rawnsley. He's one of Philadelphia's finest journalists. He writes for Foreign Policy and has written for a number of publications such as Daily Beast, Wired, War is Boring. There's all the relevant links you could need on the Hour of History website, www.hourofhistory.com. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/hour of history. There, you will find over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And let me tell you, dudes like Adam are totally listening to ebooks on apps such as Audible, because it's an excellent opportunity to engage yourself in our infinitely interesting world. Whether you're driving, walking around, just have a book going on your cell phone, learning about cool things like we talk about in this podcast. So thanks again for listening. Thanks for subscribing, and enjoy this Hour of History podcast.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. It's Stephen Bauman, Mathias Fueling, and Adam Rawnsley here today. And we're going to talk about a whole host of things. How are you doing today, Mathias?
I'm doing great. It's a really blustery, rainy day here in Philly, but fall is here. I'm starting to wear flannel.
Yes.
I've achieved my final form. My girlfriend and I had pumpkin spice coffee this morning, so I'm leaning into it.
Pumpkin spice went from being a sin on Wednesday when it was 100 degrees to being the perfect thing.
I know, it's amazing.
I'm sticking with my chamomile tea right now. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm doing all right. I, too, am looking forward to the fall. I think my favorite Onion article, His Majesty the Duke of Fall, has...
Yeah, everyone on Twitter is time to just, get the comfy blankets out, get the sweaters.
Yeah.
Sends out pumpkin spice out.
Fantastic.
Yeah, Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, Adam, you've written a whole bunch of stuff for a whole bunch of things. You've done research. You're kind of an amazing journalist. So thank you for coming to Hour of History. One thing that caught my eye was North Korea, so hopefully we'll be able to talk about that a little bit. But first, can you tell us a little bit about what it is to be a journalist in the age of fake news?
It means I get slightly more hate mail.
Nice.
But, I have a block list that's about, I think last time I checked, about 15,000. It's populated mostly through bots and stuff like that. I'm a big fan of block lists. I'm fortunate in that I exist mostly in the national security space, so all of the hate mail and obstacles that I get from that are sort of baked in. I think it's more my colleagues who are regular White House reporters who deal with that.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit scary, but it's a job.
Yeah, and so how did you get into journalism? As we were reading a lot of your articles, you have a range of material, and particularly your focus seems to be national security and intelligence. So how did that happen?
My dad was a British policeman. My grandfather was a Royal Marine Commando, and I grew up hearing lots of stories about World War II. My dad used to make me watch, what is that old World War II documentary series? The World at War, I think it was. It's the one with the zippy British narrator. But the way I got into journalism and national security stuff is I was working at a think tank because that was sort of what you did when you graduated with an international relations degree in D.C. I went to American University. And actually, it's a PBS documentary that sort of shaped my professional philosophy. It's a documentary about a guy who falls down a crevasse and manages to live while he's ice climbing. Mm-hmm. And it's the description of how you die of hypothermia that sort of has motivated a professional philosophy for me. Is that what happens is at first it's very, very cold and shocking. And then what happens is you get warm and sleepy and you stop fighting, you stop trying, you go to sleep and you die. And that was sort of how I felt about the think tank world. I was going towards probably some contractor job or some job in government. I was just I don't want to do this. And so I didn't want to, get warm and sleepy and just stop trying and die. So my friend Noah Shackman, who's now my boss, Noah Shackman, was kind enough to offer me a gig writing for Wired.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that, and it sort of started an odyssey. I went from Wired, helped a friend edit a book for a little bit, was freelance for a while, wrote for War is Boring with another Wired vet, then joined Foreign Policy, and then from Foreign Policy I have since become a reporter for the Daily Beast. Along the way, I hang out and volunteer with my friends at Bellingcat, who are a really cool open source research / news organization devoted to using open sources to investigate different types of conflicts. And yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a career path as to how to go about it, because it just sort of stumbled backwards into stuff. But
so what is your methodology? How do you go about finding a story? So like, say your North Korea story, where do these things start?
Well, with the North Korea thing, it was a little bit more prosaic. My buddy Jeff Lewis, you might know as Arms Control Wonk, I got assigned a few story requirements, and I said I wanted to do something vaguely history focused. I've always been a big history fan. And one of the things that's always sort of stood out to me was the fact that in DC, there's this wonderful resource, the National Archives, that is a big pain in the butt to use, but if you're willing to suffer through it, you can find a lot of gems. Mm-hmm. And so I asked Jeff, I was like, hey, I want to do something on North Korea. What should I look at? He's like, well, there's always been this sort of question about, in the late 1960s, Kim Il-sung tried a failed effort at launching a guerrilla war, or at least a campaign of harassment in South Korea. And he was mostly interested in, it seemed unclear to him how much the South had retaliated, who started it, and to what extent. The South's participation, I think, was the most interesting thing. So I said, sure. And it was just dumb luck. I ended up stumbling into some recently declassified archives. And that's how I found that. But generally, on other stuff, I've started out with a lot of open source trickery. There's a lot, again, it's a matter of putting the time in and planting a flag. So, like, one of the things that I spend a lot of time on that I'm still not really sure how I got into it is Iranian small arms, drones, and conventional weapon stuff.
Wow.
And that started out with just curiosity about a story. And I realized that no one had really done that much on it. So this was an area, a lot of times in journalism, it's like 5-year-olds playing soccer. There's a giant scrum for the ball and everybody's kicking and you're not really sure whether your efforts individually are going anywhere. And in this case, the reason why I liked it was because I could actually see myself moving at least the public knowledge further. And the great thing about that is, once you plant a flag on that, once you can, even if it's just moving the ball a couple yards, all of a sudden people will get in touch because you find people that you did not know who were interested in this, who had the same questions. And those people then become sources, and then you can keep moving. And now, it's become pretty handy because in Yemen, we're starting to see the kinds of things that were happening in 2006 that I was reporting on. And I have a new insight into at least some of the tools that are being used. And the great thing about that is that it's, arms are sort of the currency of covert operations. And so you can get a sense of what's going on by tracking the currency.
And so have you, through your reporting and kind of getting into intelligence, have you noticed, and also like doing stuff with North Korea, have you noticed any kind of odd continuities in the history of intelligence? Because I think most average, Joes and Janes in America think of the Cold War, right? That's the golden era of intelligence and security. And now, right, people tend to think of it as just like, oh, it's just some random CIA guy going off into the desert. But do you notice any kind of like structural kind of like continuities in the intelligence apparatus or differences?
Especially on the North Korea side. I mean, I should preface this with I've never had a security clearance, so I can't speak with absolute confidence, but having spoken to people...
Jared Kushner has one, though.
Yeah. There we go. Isn't that great? But I have spoken to a lot of people who work this issue and who do have clearances. One of the things that was that I got a kick out of. So, Foreign Policy commissioned me to write a story on the history of assassination attempts against the Kim family, to show just how durable, their reign is. And it started out with some of the early assassination attempts against Kim, or at least one. Some guy took a poke at him with a grenade at a speaking event. And it was astounding to me how fragmentary our intelligence was about him in the 1940s and how very little has changed. So you've got one, I'm looking through Army occupation records. This was in 1948, I believe they took a poke at him. And you have, they're relying on translated news sources from Korean. They've got one witness saying, actually, it wasn't a grenade attack. It was someone basically ambushed his carriage or his little convoy kind of thing as he was headed to the event, and that the such and such woman was injured and he was injured as well. And then you find out in a separate report that the woman by the same name referenced as injured in that report was actually injured in the grenade attack. So you see the same sort of fragmentary patterns of, okay, we have basically no idea who this guy is. We have very little intelligence. And then, you flash forward to CNN during the the infamous summit, and you have James Clapper, former director of national intelligence, as Dennis Rodman is having a meltdown on TV. Color commentary from James Rodman, from James Clapper is saying, I really like Dennis, and he's one of the best sources we have on Kim Jong-Un. And you can take that two ways. You can take that as, wow, James Clapper is out of his damn gourd. Or you can take it as, actually, our intelligence on, Kim Jong-il within his circle, having that sort of access, people with access to him, is so bad that Dennis frickin' Rodman, who can't even get a meeting with Kim now because he's been yapping his mouth about it, is our best source. So yeah, I mean, you do see the same sort of.
Well, I can't help but to think, though, that the Soviets must have been, in some way, that, this is a reason they chose Kim Il-sung, because no one really knows his story. And it's so ambitious of the American intelligence has to do it, but the way they describe him is like almost entirely conjecture. But you look at the other people who they're describing in those documents are almost all educated in the United States.
Yes.
So it's kind of extraordinary. Do you ever come across these cross currents? So are they talking about the Soviets in the same folders, or are these totally separate issues? Because in 1960, North Korea is beginning to interact with the Soviets and the Chinese in separate ways.
No, this is the great thing, is because, I was lucky in the 1940s documents, you can actually get DOD stuff down to the 40s. Where DOD basically, anything substantive in the archives starts to tap out is around about the 50s and the 60s. After that, you're getting nothing. God bless the State Department. I will say I will randomly thank people when they tell me they work for the State Department History Office, because the State Department History Office is excellent. And
we do have some Temple alumni, I think,
yes,
in there.
The first process, Foreign Relations of the United States, is awesome. And the great thing about, all the stuff I did on the 60s is all from State Department RG-58 record group, or RG-59, blanking on that. But you see, the great thing about that is that you do see cross currents in terms of what shows up in the archives, is that it's not just Soviet stuff, it's not just North Korean stuff, but on our side, it's you will get Defense Department documents that touched across State Department archives, so somebody gets CC'd on this, and so you get to see all that stuff. But there's some great. There's one of the documents I came across is this great trip to Pyongyang dispatch in the late 1940s. The guy who actually met Kim Il-sung, and it's a long sort of. It'd be good for a memoir. It would almost be essay, but. It's an advisor to the U.S. occupation in South Korea who is invited to Pyongyang by Soviet advisors.
Oh, wow.
And so most of the time it's him discussing, he sort of catches his anecdotal observations of what life is like in Pyongyang, because there's very little information coming back and forth. And most of the memo that he's got there is his discussions with the Soviets, and he gets only a brief vignette with Kim Il-sung. He's surrounded by these big burly guys with burp guns. But yeah, no, you definitely do get Soviet intelligence stuff wrapped up in that.
And have you noticed in your kind of journalism research any discrepancy between sort of American intelligence approaches to North Korea and info on the Kims versus South Korean intelligence and what they're doing? Because I know the usual idea, right, is like, oh, South Korea and the U.S. were simpatico, but the more I read into it, the more it's like actually South Korea and America do not see eye to eye in many ways on North Korea, even in their assessments of what's happening.
And that continues to this day, is that you will notice all of the happy talk about denuclearization is not coming from the North Koreans, it's coming from South Korean interlocutors who I would almost guarantee you are just basically scared out of their minds about what the nutty Trump administration is going to do, and so they're trying to sell a happy song of Kim is behaving, Kim is doing well. But that is, you see that same tension play out, and I would highly recommend, if anyone is interested in this, again, the State Department does history, awesome. It's the, Association of Diplomatic Studies, I forget, I can give it to you for the show notes, but they do a great, fantastic series of oral history interviews with former diplomats. And one of the guys they interviewed was former CIA station chief to Seoul in the 1970s. And it is hilarious. It's fantastic. Donald Gregg later became ambassador. And there's this great, it's a great anecdote that shows you the sort of tension and the dual missions. Because not only were we worried about what the North Koreans were doing, we were worried about what the South Koreans were doing. We were worried about what the South Koreans were doing relative to the North Koreans. We were also worried what the South Koreans were doing relative to the South Koreans, because Park Chung-hee was a pretty vicious dictator who had a habit of kidnapping, torturing, and murdering his enemies. And so there's this great vignette in the Gregg oral history where he's talking about the problem of reining in the South Koreans and keeping an eye on them. In particular, at one point, we had told them, we do not want you to buy any submarines. We do not want you to, you do not need them. You do not have a, need to have a unilateral capability like that. We've got plenty of submarines. Don't worry about it. Basically because the United States government did not want the South Koreans pulling any naval hijinks that they couldn't know about. So, the South Koreans obviously did not like being treated like a colony, so they decided, forget it, we're going to buy our own submarines and not tell you about it. And so the CIA finds out about it. And then they have this problem. How do we have a discussion about, this submarine and our concerns about it without blowing our sources on this? So they came up with a very inventive way. They phoned up the South Korean Navy and they said, we want to make sure you get all your units out of here because we found a South Korean submarine or a North Korean submarine and we're about to sink it. Pointing to the coordinates of their own submarine. And so all of a sudden the South Koreans, wait, no, hang on. Oh, okay. We got to have a conversation here. But that's emblematic of, and there's this the best document I found, and this was part of the recently declassified batch, was late 1960s, Stuart Symington starts what's known as the Symington Committee, and it's all about concerns about U.S. military commitments abroad. This is a product of Vietnam. Congress is very aware that our escalating military commitments in Vietnam sort of spiraled and got us into this quagmire, and they are anxious that we not repeat it. This is the early 1970s. And so they go about surveying all the different combatant commands about, okay, well, what have you promised to all these various people about what you will do in the event of hostilities? And so this is a declassified series of memos answering questions from the Symington Committee about what exactly we have promised and what exactly is going on in South Korea relative to North Korea. And it's the best description I've seen in terms of U.S. documents affirming what South Korean Army Intelligence Unit veterans have said, which is that we did a whole lot of raiding ourselves across the DMZ. So in late 1960s, Kim Il-sung decides that he wants to provoke a low-grade guerrilla war. Whether or not he actually wanted to win the war or just embark on a campaign of harassment is an interesting historical question that is, we'll table that. But
So what happens is he starts amplifying the number of cross-border incidents. He's sending more people into the DMZ. He's blowing up stuff. 16 U.S. troops ended up dying. 16 U.S. troops from U.S. or 2nd Infantry Division ended up dying and being killed in this stuff. But a lot of it was sending unconventional warfare units from the Reconnaissance General Bureau, which is their intelligence organization. Foot reconnaissance units handled provocations in the DMZ. RGB handled, sending commandos, and they'd send them into the South Korean interior with the belief that, you could sort of proselytize the people about the glories of Kim Il-sung, that they'd rise up against the South Korean regime. Mm-hmm. So this is driving the South Korean units absolutely nuts. And they, in January 1968, they get a 124th Army unit, which is the super duper special operations unit, gets within a few hundred feet of the Blue House Palace. Uh-huh. And they almost, were able to take a poke at Park. So they are absolutely on edge. There's a great transcript where Park Chung-hee is having this conversation with Lyndon Baines Johnson, and LBJ just cannot understand. He's just not grokking how on edge it has. So he's talking about, we want you to give more divisions to the war in Vietnam. Can you do that for us? Can you commit? And Park is saying, no, you don't understand. I've got this problem. And LBJ's just not getting it. And at one point he says, I sleep with a loaded carbine in my bedroom. And it's just not registering. So this is how unsettled they were. And as part of the morale problems, what they had to do was, because when, and this is not unique to South Koreans at the DMZ in the 60s, is, anytime when you lose units or when you lose guys in a unit, that's a big morale problem. You're hungry for revenge. You got, maybe the unit leader wants to go trolling for contact. So as a matter of maintaining their morale, as a matter of deterrence, the South Koreans went on a covert campaign of retaliation in the DMZ, which scared the snot out of the U.S. government because, we've got a North-South war between a northern communist government in Vietnam and a southern non-communist government trying to support in Vietnam. We do not want to have the same problem again in Korea. And the South Koreans are sending in guys to blow up units, and I have his name here. There's a great Korea Times piece that he Lee Jin-sam. He's a former South Korean Army intelligence unit veteran. Was a member of the intelligence units that were carrying out these things, and they were pretty vicious. They were pretty nasty. Bust into a barrack, shoot everybody, make your way across the border. And the best document I found was the Symington Committee talking about these raids and talking about how concerned they were. And in particular, there's a very pregnant section where it says, they're going on a list of all the different raids, all the different installations they've blown up in the DMZ. The fact that the United Nations Command, which is was the United Nations operation at that point, was trying to stress to them that we do not want you to do these things because this is a problem for us. And so at the end of it, they say, well, listen, if you want more information, please contact the NSA and ask about this particular unit, which is an implicit admission that we were having some pretty good SIGINT coverage of the South Korean Army intelligence units because we were concerned about them. So
this information is an enormous amount of primary source research that I'm hearing that from these interviews that are supposedly compiled by the U.S. intelligence, right? These documents. And how are you contextualizing this information? Is it just how do we know the validity? I'm sure there were sort of communication errors. There were serious misunderstandings in the reports. Might be very different from the actual conversation.
Yes. Well, in that case, that was so what happens is that was 8th Army UN Command. But if you look through the great thing, way back in the day, you actually had to go to the archives to print out CIA Crest database stuff because the CIA was a passive aggressive child. Mm-hmm. And they would literally they had, because this became, it was like, you remember in Full House when like they get the label maker and then they start making labels and label everybody's. They did that at the National Archives, and they're at the Crest terminals. They would be, property of CIA. But now, thank God, it's all available online. But you can see it's being picked up not just in their reporting, but it's being picked up in CIA reports. Is the great thing is one of the things that frequently gets declassified is the weekly the summaries. So you're getting fairly low. Obviously it's analyzed, it's processed, but it's not. You're not getting raw intelligence. But you can triangulate it with that, and also there are a number of South Korean Army veterans who have complained about this stuff, because the thing is, and what people will tell you is, a lot of people got sent above the DMZ and not a lot of people came back.
Right.
And their families are very upset about that, understandably so. And so this became and you saw this again after the 124th Army Unit fiasco. Park Chung-hee decided that he was going to repay Kim Il-sung in kind. And he trained a small, similarly sized group of, a lot of them were prisoners, on Symington Island for basically what was going to be a suicide mission to kill Kim Il-sung. He never pulled the trigger on that. He got cold feet, and then he had an island full of people bearing a very, very, very big secret that he couldn't necessarily trust, and basically kept them as prisoners there until they revolted. They kind of went nuts, killed most of their guards, fled onto the mainland, and headed to Seoul in a bus and blew themselves up with grenades. And so their relatives sued the government, and they also sued the producer of a movie about the incident, which is a very interesting movie called Symington. And so you can learn a little bit about that. But there are veterans of these sort of covert wars on the South Korean side whose testimonies jive very well with what shows up in the documents. Interesting factoid. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly here. Kim Shin-jo was the one survivor in the South of the raid against Park Chung-hee when they tried to assassinate Park Chung-hee. And he went to prison. He's been released, and now he's an evangelical Christian. He's a pastor, I believe, but the New York Times caught up with him, had a chat with him. Fun story, one of the guards at Symington Island, who was training / torturing the South Korean unit that was supposed to repay Kim Il-sung for that, is still alive, and he now is an evangelical pastor in South Korea. I was trying to talk to him for the foreign policy piece I wrote. I had a fixer in Seoul who's working on logistics, but at the time he didn't work out, he was traveling. But I'm dying to find out at some point if those two guys, because they're not at the same church, right, but I'm dying to find out if those guys have ever met, because those are interesting career trajectories.
Yeah, they could do like a duet kind of
pastors of the '60s group.
But with that, this sounds like kind of a different story than most people seem to have with North and South Korea, because it sounds like you're setting up kind of a narrative of there's like dueling dictatorships. So Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee, and they're both trying to kill each other, and they're both kind of dueling for favor with the great superpowers.
Yes, but
they sound very much kind of on equal terms, whereas now, of course, we have this image of the evil empire in the north, and then these like lovely hyper sci-fi technology South Koreans or something like that.
Yes, it was not immediately obvious at the time that South Korea would shake off its dictatorship, and there was a greater the moral equivalency argument became easier, but the interesting thing is, even at that point, and the other thing is that South Korea was nowhere near as rich as it is now, and it's the gap between South Korea and North Korea economically was not as great. And the interesting thing is, even despite that, the lesson that I took away, at least, and that people emphasized to me from reporting on that period, was even at that point, even when, the thing is that the idea of North Korea ever trying something similar now is ridiculous. At least in the narrow sense that they're not going to try and start a revolution in the South, because the idea of people in South Korea, which is one of the most prosperous, countries in the world, would all of a sudden be, have any sort of ideological affinity for, one of the poorest countries in the world, a Stalinist dictatorship is ridiculous. But they didn't learn that lesson until the 1960s. They didn't learn it until they tried. And one of the and it worked both ways, because there's the description. So in the 124th Army Unit, when they were doing this, and they weren't the only unit who was doing this. What they would do sea infiltration stuff, where you take unconventional warfare units and put them in boats that are designed to look like fishing boats, send them down south, and then they're supposed to hole up for the winter, or what they do is find a village and proselytize about the glories of Kim Il-sung. Mm-hmm. And as you might imagine, that went nowhere. And there's a great, you get a closer understanding of it from looking at the 124th Army stuff, because when they first crossed the DMZ, they came across a bunch of woodcutters, and they figured, should we kill them? It's January, the ground is cold, it's going to take a while to bury them in the frozen ground, so we'll just kidnap them, we'll proselytize. But from the captured prisoners and from the intelligence they got from that, became clear that they knew at that point that the South Koreans, whenever they came across these infiltrators, would rat them out to the police like that. Mm. It was not, they were not receptive at all to that. Even then, even at a period where memories of the Korean War were still fresh, when South Korea was not a prosperous democracy, the North Koreans found no fertile ground for their promised revolution. And it worked the other way as well, which does not get reported as much because we don't know as much. The South Koreans were not able to develop resistance networks. They were not able to, develop support networks in the North because, we don't have as much good information on why those failed, because we just frankly don't have that much information on it. But I think it's fair to say is that, North Korea, or the Korean War, was pretty nasty. The ideological inclinations of North Koreans, whether or not it's, actual ideology or just, self-preservation to restore the state. The idea that even despite the penury that they lived in and the Stalinist dictatorship that sat atop them, they were not game to rise up, the South Koreans.
Well, I think one of the things that people don't mention often that also appeared in the documents a little bit is the religion in Korea. Korea is the most Christian Asian nation. There were a lot of Christians in Pyongyang. In fact, in the first briefing, it says Kim Il-sung's a Christian. And the school I used to teach at in China would be visited by Kim Jong-un, the church that his father used to go to.
And he does not play that up in his biography. His official biography,
now there's like persecution of Christians.
Right. And so what happens is he adopts this line, and then the Christians go south. But so there's a massive demographic shift in Korea. So it's little mystery about the sort of like, they don't have uniformity in response to North Korea because they're all from different villages for centuries. How much does religion and sort of like demographic differences, education, do those appear in the documents among South Koreans?
Not as much, but I can say at least, recently religion is a factor in the intelligence wars because a lot of the organizations that work with defectors and people who come across from the North, because they still, this is a big thing. You still get lots of people sneak across the Chinese border. It's less common that they will come across the DMZ because that is, very, very, very dangerous. You saw recently as a few months ago, a few soldiers actually made it across the DMZ. They made it like right around the what's the name of that little village there? But that's not as common. You also see there's a bit of a diplomatic issue about it, defections from a restaurant in Cambodia. But a lot of the organizations in South Korea that work to resettle North Koreans who have come south are evangelical Christian. And this has also come up a little bit, and it's a very sensitive issue because it involves the propriety of using these organizations But there are evangelical Christian organizations that have allegedly been, I think The Intercept had a piece on this, working with, they cross in from the north through China where it's easier to cross, and they have their own little networks in the north, and they reportedly provide some intelligence to either the South Koreans or the U.S., and that becomes very controversial because you're using aid groups, you're using groups that should normally be considered like non-combatants in the intelligence wars, and you're risking the traditional neutrality, whether or not it's actually respected. You risk that sort of stuff. So that has become you see a lot of, and I think it's actually one of the. I need to check this. One of the guys who was arrested for working at a university in North Korea and was subsequently released was an evangelical Christian.
Interesting.
But yeah, you see that, because it tends to be a little bit more politically conservative. Definitely they're not that they're necessarily more anti-North Korean, but they're at least more motivated for ideological and religious reasons. But that's generally speaking. I don't see much mention of religion in the early Cold War docs, but certainly it's become an issue now.
Yeah, and with kind of that and talking about kind of intelligence networks, I mean, have you come across any info in these documents about like active CIA units or like assets or agents in South Korea or KGB maybe? I'm assuming, usually I know the documents can be really shadowy about this, but I usually assume that anytime there's like these kind of divides, they're swarming with all kinds of intelligence assets and maybe even active agents of like the KGB, CIA, and how much of that comes out in the documents. So
not in terms of, if you want actual very, very granular stuff in terms of raw reports from that are not from the so CIA is divided into, generally speaking, two halves. You have DI, Director of Intelligence, DO, Director of Operations. Most of the declassified stuff you're going to get comes from the DI side. So you're getting stuff that is, stripped of mentions of not so much methods, but definitely sources. And if you want that sort of stuff, the most granular declassified CIA stuff I've seen is from PB Success, which is the Guatemala operation. And that got declassified in the 1990s because it was part of, you remember in the 1990s, there was that controversy over the fact that the U.S. had recruited a Guatemalan army officer who ended up killing Americans. And that's when the PB Success docs were declassified. And that is you can see raw operational documents. And that is very, very rare. Other than a lot of the World War II OSS stuff, and the forget the full name of the act, but essentially we had a declassified Nazi war criminal document. So basically, if you're a Nazi war criminal, can't use that as an excuse for the CIA to withhold documents. I think there is a little bit of operational stuff in some of the Cuba docs. Because ironically enough, this is one of the weird things of historical analysis is the very terrible, historically inaccurate movie by Oliver Stone, JFK, produced a very awesome law that declassified lots of presidential assassination record stuff. And you would think, okay, so why do JFK? But all the Cuba stuff, not all of Cuba, a lot of Cuba stuff got sucked out through that and got declassified through that. But in terms of actual sources, you will not see that in declassified documents. You will see, I would, if you're interested in sources, Don Gregg in his oral history interview with a non-governmental organization talks about, they had sources in the KCIA. They had sources all over the place because a lot of their work was trying to find out what the KCIA was up to, whether they were planning anything stupid. With reference to North Korea, or every once in a while Park Chung-hee would kidnap a political rival of his, and so there's a vignette where he's talking about how they got word through their own people in the KCIA that Kim Jong-un had been kidnapped from his hotel room in Tokyo, and Don Gregg basically says, "Let him go."
So
This is going to be bad for you. Let him go.
So beside the bomb throwing at Kim Il-sung that was heroically saved by this Soviet operative that becomes a folk hero in North Korea, are there any other? What was the closest that the U.S. ever got to Kim Il-sung? And is there anything in the record that Trump might find appealing should things go bad with Kim Jong-Un?
Well, that's an interesting. That's probably the greatest moral peril that Kim Il-sung probably came in, other than the Korean War, where he spent a lot of his time hiding out in underground bunkers. They developed a pretty. And this is the thing is that sitting atop an organization like the North Korean government is a very difficult job in terms of staying alive, because their biggest threats, generally speaking, aren't from the outside, they're from the inside. And the greatest threats to the Kims have always been from the inside. There's an incident, and in particular, the 1990s were the most perilous years for the Kim dynasty in recent memory, because that was when you had the arduous march, the big famine. You have communist dictatorships around the world falling apart, and people are wondering, is North Korea going to be the next shoe to drop? And so you have tank units in Hamhung province going on the move, and it's that was one of the more sort of. People still speculate about whether or not that was actual assassination attempt, or whether that was just a KPA unit getting kind of grumpy that was not getting its cut. You have that mysterious incident where there was an explosion on a train track, and we know Kim Jong-il was very, very big fan of using his super train. And there's question whether or not that was actually an accident, whether that was an assassination attempt. But in terms of the 1990, or in terms of assassination attempts, that was the sort of greatest threat. And now you see with Kim Jong-un, the first thing he's done when he came into office is start, rolling heads. Basically, the biggest safety measure he's had was, or not necessarily a safety measure. I don't want to endorse it as necessarily the appropriate thing to do, but he, Jang Song-thaek sleeps with the fishes now. His uncle, for various reasons that people will argue about, he had his own uncle lined up before a bunch of anti-aircraft artillery and torn apart.
Yikes.
And so he's locked things down pretty tight and gone on a series of internal purges. He also VX'd his half-brother.
Yeah.
Because in theory, he could have presented a challenge to the line of succession. But the problem, this was the gist of the piece that I wrote for Foreign Policy, is that you start to see decapitation becoming a bigger area of interest for the U.S. in the latter Obama years. And I think it was one of the second to last or the last, there was a very, one of the annual exercises towards the end of the Obama era focused on trying to practice decapitation tricks, and the reason why that takes on prominence now is because their nuclear deterrent is now pretty much complete, and by the time that was being practiced, it was obvious that it was getting there. And so the idea is you want to shut down the nuclear chain of command as much as possible in the event you have to do a preemptive strike, or you get word that the missiles are on the move. You want to prevent more missiles from being fired, that kind of thing. And it's not just the U.S. that is interested in that. You see the South Koreans. They have a new series of land attack cruise missiles that they've been practicing on targets that look an awful lot like they're shaped like the official residence in North Korea.
Right.
And that gets into lots of questions about, okay, this has become an issue now. So who now has launch authority in the North Korean government? Are you necessarily confident that if you can scalp a Kim, that someone else isn't going to be able to press that button? And it gets into, there's all sorts, I talked with some former Army Special Operations guys And the plan is basically, at least, or the guess, what people should say, the guess of what the North Korean plan in the event of a war is. Obviously, the nuclear component changes that, but, factor out the nuclear stuff. So he's got a lot of bunkers in Pyongyang. And you can go through recently declassified stuff, and you can see, Defense Threat Reduction Agency and all these sort of bunker nerds paying a lot of close attention to research out of North Korean universities on, bunker construction and underground construction, that type of stuff. But that would not be, you can't live out the bunker in Pyongyang forever. I think the best guess that I heard is that, in the event of a war, again, separating out the trying to game out the nuclear stuff, is that his plan would be you sort of try to delay the Americans as much as time in order for you to boogie on across the border and shack up in China. Yeah. And then, because the Chinese do not want the U.S. right, or the South Koreans right on their border. They want to keep a nice buffer state. And so it's not like the Chinese are just going to, fold and say, all right, well, you got them, that's good. They're probably going to want to preserve some sort of rump North Korean state as a buffer. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the best guess as to how he tries to evade assassination.
Dang. And then they could also use him maybe later as the kind of inject him as this the savior for a new state.
Which would, and that's the interesting thing is that because I know next to nothing about Chinese army units, but I'm not really familiar that China has that much recent experience in unconventional warfare. We know the North Koreans did it in the 1960s. The United States, we have the Green Berets, which are our premier unconventional warfare unit, but who in the PLA is responsible for that?
What about the Vietnam wars that China had?
Yes, yeah. But that was a little bit more conventional. The funny, not funny factor, but I hear this from my mine action friends all the time. Is that there, as recently as like a couple of years ago, technically speaking, people are still dying from that war because they laid so many mines across the border. Yeah. The PLA is still doing demining action, and I think a PLA soldier just about a year ago died from that. So,
and so do you think, with all of your research, and you've obviously sounds like you spent a long time thinking about these issues, do you feel like you have any insight into what could possibly happen with the current sort of Trump administration's gambit, or is it just a total like no one knows because it's just too many wild cards?
I think I tend to my good buddy is Jeff Lewis, Arms Control Onc, and he's written a pretty interesting and scary book.
Oh, that just came out in 2020. Yeah.
About basically it's a speculative fiction alternative history about how Donald Trump could lead us into a nuclear confrontation. I honestly, the most difficult variable to suss out in that is Trump, and I think. I've had this conversation a few times with friends, and Jeff's thing is, well, what happens is, what happens when the promised denuclearization, which is just not going to happen, guys, doesn't materialize. And Jeff knows this better than essentially anyone, so I'm not going to try and challenge that. But I would look at Trump's relationship with other leaders where he has a problematic relationship, like Xi Jinping. And there's plenty on the U.S.-China table that it does not appeal to Trump. On trade, on dealing with North Korea, there's, he said all manner of awful things about China during the campaign. But he still kind of has a weird bromance going with Xi Jinping, and he's not really willing to pull the trigger on absolutely flipping the bird in a way that would alienate him personally. And that seems to be sort of what's going on with Kim Jong-Un, is that you have this weird, complicated relationship. And, they went forward with the indictment of an RGB officer for hacking Sony just last week. They declassified a lot of that, and they went forward with that indictment. And so that would complicate things, but at the same time, he's still saying nice things. I think, maybe I should preface this with I hope, but I think as long as Kim keeps the missile tests to a dull roar and doesn't, because obviously their ICBM is proven, their warhead is proven. Their systems are complete. They have the deterrent they want. No one should really doubt that they at least have a very, very good chance of wiping out a couple American cities. And so he doesn't have any reason, in terms of pure military necessity, to do provocative things that drove Trump nuts, like testing missiles. So I think as long as he doesn't test, and as long as he, makes nice general motions, things just sort of stay at a steady state. Famous last words. I don't live on the West Coast, but they can reach DC with their ICBMs too. But if you look at just yesterday, we had a nice big military parade, and that's another sign that Kim Jong-Un has Donald Trump pretty well figured out. If you looked at that parade, everybody was expecting to see the big, cool Hwasong ICBM, and they didn't show it. It was all, boring little land units. There's some weird little anti-tank guided missile, and like the Turtle Mobile.
For that was the 70th anniversary. This is an absolutely huge event. Yes. So that kind of
which
thing
is normally, it's my North Korean nerd friends. They call these things Juche fests. You stream KCTV on your Apple TV through VLC. You watch these things. Chad from North Korean News was actually, judging by the photo credits, he was actually in North Korea for the parade. So you try and shake down whoever for high res, so you can get pictures of the markings and you see this kind of stuff. And it was a total snooze fest.
Wow. And so can you talk a little bit about the response that you get? So you've kind of mentioned in terms of just Twitter responses, but like what about from the academic community and people who have sort of like worked on North Korea their whole life? Do they push back, or do they engage with you? What is the conversation between journalist and historian?
So my main academic conduit is my buddy Jeff at Monterey, and Jeff sort of, if you follow him on Twitter, Jeff is not a very conventional academic. He's very he's much more comfortable interacting with journalists. But there are, Jeff is not the only person who works on this. There are a lot of people who work on North Korea. I think, generally speaking, the problem that a lot of North Korea analysts who do this in the academy worry about with great legitimacy is that North Korea is just sort of this weird, wacky, like it's basically, it's like a Vice cartoon. And they want to avoid that. And they want to, because, you really couldn't, if you tried to script this for a TV show, you really couldn't script it better in terms of the weirdness factor. But they want to maintain some sort of, a lot of it also falls into they're worried about, because, people like to paint the North Koreans as crazy, as sort of Martians, as sort of, this otherworldly people, when they're just, I wouldn't say they're just like you and me, because they have very, very different experiences, but, they're normal people in the sense that, they have hopes, they have dreams, they have needs, they have interests. And it's very easy for journalists to fall into the trap of, here's this weird, wacky Stalinist dictatorship where, people are imprisoned in camps. And, so they want to maintain a lot of the simplification that comes with journalism. They're very wary of it. And I try to be respectful of that. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I found is so Joe Bermudez is a great, he's a consultant, academic. He does a lot of stuff. And he works with 38 North, and he's the repository of, he used to write a KPA journal, which is, so there's not that much out there on the Korean People's Army and the academic literature in terms of conventional stuff. And so if you're looking for missile histories, if you're looking for nuclear histories, you're spoiled for choice. When I was looking for stuff about, basic leadership, when I was looking for stuff about North Korean Special Operations Unit, there's not that much. And so I think one of the things that I try to do when I approach professors, and it's generally a good thing to do as a reporter in general, is do your homework. Show that you're serious. And so, when so Joe has a collection of some of the greatest primary source stuff on North Korea around. And he's just a delightful, wonderful man. And, I think the conversation goes easier when I show up to, his inbox saying, I've gone to the archives, I've done my homework. I'm not parachuting into this and just, trying to do a hit and run here. I'm actually investing in this. And I think that makes the conversation goes easier and gets people's back down, that they're not going to be taken out of context and put in some sort of embarrassing, vice feature.
Yeah. And have you spent much time then in Korea?
I have not. I've not. All of my research on that has been archival and talking to U.S. folks. So that's one of the things you should take into account when you read my stuff, is that, I'm very much coming at this from a U.S. perspective. I'm coming at this from a U.S. government perspective because the documents I'm getting from the U.S. government. Most of the academics I'm talking to are Americans, and most of the sort of practitioners that I'm talking to are former U.S. U.S. officials.
Well, and it certainly sounds like you've done your homework, and I think it's it's good because, historians are always jabbing at journalists, and journalists sort of the same thing. You put out great stuff, and I think it's such an important note that you're working together and that you are doing your homework, and it really does show in the articles. When North Korea, a lot of times they just put out quick pieces that are just there's no research behind it.
Yeah, or it's sort of like weird, kind of like I think that's sort of what you're saying, Adam, kind of like spectator pornography.
Yeah,
like on Fox News, it would be like they do like some weird CGI thing of like, look at what the Koreans did. They threw this guy in this pit and had him eaten alive by dogs or something. Yeah.
And you get like a lot of that. Like you get, I think is Daily NK, which is the defector publication. They publish in English, so a lot of that stuff gets swept up. But yeah, it can be hard to suss out what's true and what's false, because a lot of the times what is true is crazy. So like with, in the one case where they assassinated a bunch of folks with anti-aircraft guns, we heard that story first and we're just like, oh, I don't know about that. It's hard to know. But then 38 North got satellite photos of, the anti-aircraft gun emplacements. We're like, oh, that's actually true. Oh dear. But yeah, the being torn apart by dogs things, no.
So we're here. The hour has flown by. We typically end our sessions with one suggestion. So for the people that come and read the episode notes, and the people who, the suggestion can be anything under the moon. I'll start this week. My suggestion for the week is a memory of mine from Korea. In 2009, they had this great Korean drama called Iris, which is about how South Korean and North Korean intelligence agencies work together to keep the two countries apart. And so it's a fantastic K-drama if you're into that sort of thing, and you should be able to find it online. Iris.
And I think with that, I'll take a more academic-y recommendation.
All right.
What was it? The Origins of the Korean War.
Bruce Cumings. Bruce
Cumings. It's a very famous 2-volume work by Bruce Cumings about kind of the origins of the Korean War. It's very polemical. It had a huge influence in academic circles. It's still pretty widely cited. A lot of people criticize it, but it's still a big deal. So if you're looking for like a good, big kind of academic work on like what's up with the Korean War, how did this happen, that's a good place to start.
It's fantastic. Yeah, and he also has the more like general interest Korea's Place Under the Sun, which is like a summary of those two books.
Yeah.
I'm an evangelist for archives, and so my suggestion would be go to the CIA's website and poke through the Crest database, because it is still underutilized. I still have friends who are poking through it and finding connections between the documents and between the documents in there and documents found elsewhere. It is a wonderful resource, and I guess in terms of book suggestions, read my buddy Jeff's book, 2020 Commission.
2020. And then another thing. So you mentioned, last parting shot.
Sure.
For an aspiring journalist, if they hear this, what do? They just go onto the CIA website? Should they send an idea to a publication? How does a journalist get started with that piece of advice?
The easiest thing to do is start a blog. Because if you don't have any publications, I realize that it feels a little bit mid-2000s. But
this is peak Bush 2 era.
Honestly, if you want to get started, the easiest thing is to be able to demonstrate what you can already do. And it doesn't matter if it's yourname.com, just do it. Clips are the easiest way to figure out whether or not somebody is capable of doing something. And so if you want to start looking through archives, I strongly suggest, if you want to write, just write.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. It's been a fantastic hour of history. Time flies when you're having fun. Hour of history, our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening.